"No, Lena, you're not playing tonight." With those 6 words, a teenage pianist's dream is shattered by a controlling coach, just moments before her first solo performance. But what no one sees coming is that this quiet girl, humiliated and discarded, will return to the stage with nothing but raw emotion and a haunting melody that stuns an entire auditorium and flips the power dynamic forever. What begins as a painful act of silencing transforms into a national journey of rediscovery, healing, and poetic justice. Watch as Lena rises, not for fame, but for every unheard soul who's been told they don't belong. Her final note? It doesn't just break the silence, it becomes a legacy. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "No, Lena, you're not playing tonight." The words sliced through the backstage air like a cold blade. Lena's fingers froze inches from the fabric of her dress. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, eyes wide. Mr. Kessler stood there, clipboard in hand, face set like stone. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper above the distant hum of the audience gathering in the auditorium. He didn't even look at her. "You're not ready. You're too emotional on the keys. Sloppy, you'll ruin the program." Lena's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her heart began to pound. Each beat screaming against the silence her voice could not break. The dress she had ironed 3 times that morning now felt suffocating, like a costume she wasn't allowed to wear. She had practiced every night for months, fingers bleeding more than once over those trembling black and white keys. And now, just moments before the curtain rose, she was being erased. "I can play it," came a voice from behind her. Erica, Kessler's prize student, blonde, composed, and expressionless as ever. Lena didn't turn. She already knew what was happening. "Good, you're up," Kessler said without missing a beat. "We don't have time for fragile egos." It wasn't ego. It was her heart. But Lena knew better than to argue with a man like him. She stood there in the wings as Erica stepped into her spotlight. The stage lights glowed golden and warm, but Lena felt none of it. Only the cool draft of rejection brushing her arms as the curtains parted. Her name wasn't announced. No one would know she was even meant to be there. The auditorium clapped politely as Erica sat at the piano bench. Lena, numb, drifted toward the far side of the stage, out of sight, where the shadows could hold her grief a little longer. She sat on the edge of a black equipment case, the echoes of the piano drifting past her like the notes were afraid to touch her. It was the piece she had prepared. Every rise and fall, every crescendo and silence, she knew it intimately. But it wasn't her song anymore. It had been stolen, and no one would ever know. Out front, the crowd gave another round of applause as Erica took a shallow bow and exited with a practiced smile. Kessler, smug and satisfied, gave her a thumbs up and scribbled something on his clipboard. Lena's hand sat folded in her lap now. Still. Cold. The pianist who had trained in silence, in sorrow, in shadow, was once again expected to fade into it. But not everyone had forgotten. In the 3rd row of the auditorium, a silver-haired woman sat motionless as the applause died down. Her eyes never left the side of the stage. Lena's grandmother, Ruth, had known loss. She had buried a husband who sang lullabies off-key, but always with love. She had taken in Lena when Lena's mother disappeared without goodbye. She had listened to Lena's first attempts at playing piano on a broken keyboard from a thrift store. And she had believed. Tonight, that belief turned to fire. Backstage, Kessler was already preparing the next student to go on. Lena stood slowly, not sure whether to cry or to scream. Her fingertips still remembered the piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. "Lena, honey," a young tech assistant said as he jogged over, headset crackling. "There's, a problem." She blinked. "What?" "Final performer dropped out last minute. Food poisoning. We've got a 10-minute gap at the end of the show. Mr. Alvarez said we need to fill it." Kessler's not happy. She stared at him, uncertain whether to laugh or sob. It felt like fate was mocking her now. "I told him you could do something," the tech whispered. "I heard you play last week after rehearsals. It was honestly the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You should do it." I don't know if I can," Lena murmured. "You already can," he said, then vanished as quickly as he came. A minute later, the event coordinator approached Kessler with the update. "We need someone to fill in that last spot. Quick." "Use someone else," Kessler said. "She's not ready. She chokes under pressure." But this time, the audience had overheard. The nearby microphone caught more than it should have. Someone shouted from the seats, "Let the girl play." Then another, and another. The crowd began murmuring, clapping, building like a wave. "Let her play." Lena stepped forward, hesitant, cheeks burning, every nerve alive. She could feel every eye turned toward her. Kessler stared, jaw clenching, but he didn't stop her. Not now. The walk to the piano felt longer than the years she had waited for this. The stage stretched wide, silent. Her shoes clicked softly across the wood floor, and when she sat down, it wasn't with defiance. It was with quiet surrender, to the music, to her heart, to the moment she never believed she'd be allowed to have. She stared down at the keys. Her hands hovered. Then, for just a moment, she remembered. She was 6, sitting on the floor of her grandmother's living room, pressing the plastic keys of that old keyboard, barely able to reach both ends. Ruth had stood in the doorway with tears in her eyes as Lena fumbled through Clair de Lune. She hadn't played it right, but she had played it honestly. That memory alone was enough. She closed her eyes and began. The first note was soft, unsure. Then came the second and the third. Her fingers, pale and shaking, began to find rhythm in the tremble. The song she chose wasn't the one she had rehearsed endlessly. It was older, simpler. One her mother used to hum when folding laundry in the kitchen. One that smelled like lavender and rain. One that didn't demand perfection. It simply needed to be felt. The audience fell still. The stage melted away. Each note she played was a word she had never been allowed to say. Each pause, a breath she had held far too long. The melody didn't shout, it whispered, and that whisper somehow grew louder than thunder. From behind the curtain, Kessler watched, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they turned white. The crowd should have been bored, unimpressed. She wasn't doing trills or flourishes or fast runs. She was just playing. But the crowd wasn't bored. They were spellbound. By the end, there was no applause yet. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes only after something sacred. Then someone in the back stood up, then another, and another. The room erupted. Lena sat there, stunned, the final note still vibrating faintly beneath her fingertips. She had not prepared for this moment. She hadn't expected anything more than a chance to be heard. Now the whole room was listening. Now the silence was over. The clapping wouldn't stop. It built, surged, swelled, like the sea rolling onto shore after a long, relentless silence. Lena remained seated at the piano, hands still resting over the final chord, as if the echo of it lingered in her bones. The stage lights glowed soft above her now, almost reverent, as though the piano itself had transformed from an instrument into a confessional. She had not meant to cry, but tears clung to her lashes anyway, heavy as memory. The audience had seen something raw, something real, and in a world so often obsessed with polish and performance, they had fallen in love with honesty. Backstage, Kessler stood frozen. Not just still. Frozen. Like a man watching the very walls he'd built crumble, brick by controlling brick. His arms were still crossed, but the confidence in his stance had cracked. A flicker of disbelief in his eyes betrayed the control he so carefully maintained. He turned away sharply, trying to gather himself as more members of the audience rose to their feet. He wasn't used to losing. He especially wasn't used to losing to someone he had deemed invisible. Lena stood slowly, bowing with awkward, heartfelt gratitude. She didn't know how to be the center of attention. She only knew how to survive under it. As she turned to leave the stage, her eyes found one anchor in the room, her grandmother. Ruth was standing too, hands clasped, face streaked with tears. She didn't clap, she just nodded, as if saying, "I see you, I always have." And somehow, that quiet nod meant more than all the applause in the world. Behind the curtain, the event organizer rushed to Lena. "That was," she started, but words failed. "You moved them. Everyone. That wasn't a performance, it was a revelation." Lena opened her mouth, trying to find something to say that wasn't soaked in disbelief. "I wasn't even supposed to play," she whispered. The organizer's expression hardened slightly as her eyes darted over Lena's shoulder toward Kessler, who was now pretending to be busy with his clipboard again. "Well," the woman said gently, "sometimes the best things aren't planned. Sometimes they just happen when the truth has waited long enough to be heard. Lena didn't know what to say to that either, so she just nodded and looked down at her hands. For the first time, she didn't see failure or hesitation in them. She saw power. The moment she stepped back into the dressing room, everything changed. Students she'd rehearsed beside but who'd never spoken to her were suddenly offering smiles, high fives, congratulations. Some touched her arm with quiet admiration. Others just looked at her like she had become something more than they thought she was. Not a rival, not a mistake, but an artist. Erica stood in the corner, arms folded tightly, eyes unreadable. She didn't speak, just watched as Lena moved through a crowd that now gathered around her. Kessler stood behind Erica, stiff and pale. He said nothing either. Not congratulations, not apology, only silence. It was a silence that screamed louder than any outburst. Later that night, as the last few people filtered out of the auditorium and the echoes of applause faded into quiet, Lena sat on the front steps of the building beside her grandmother. The spring night was cool, the stars just starting to burn through the deep blue of the sky. "I didn't think I could do it," Lena said softly. Ruth didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn cloth. Inside it, a folded piece of paper. "What's that?" Ruth handed it to her granddaughter. Lena unfolded it carefully. It was a newspaper clipping, old and faded, a review. Ruth Morrison, an educator with music in her bones. The article spoke of how Ruth, decades ago, had been a music teacher in a small town school, how she'd inspired hundreds of students with nothing but an upright piano, a gentle voice, and unshakable faith in every child who walked into her classroom. It spoke of how she had once turned down an offer to join a state orchestra because a student needed her more. "I used to play," Ruth said, smiling faintly. "Not like you. You've got fire. I was more like sunlight. Soft, steady." Lena looked up at her, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because your music had to be yours," Ruth said. "Not mine, not your mother's, not your coach's, just yours." She leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from Lena's forehead. "But I always knew you'd find your way." Lena looked back down at the paper. It had curled at the corners from time and love. "Did Mom know you played?" "She did. And she played too. We were different kinds of broken, your mom and me. She got lost before she could find her sound. But you," Ruth's voice caught, "you found yours, and the world just heard it." Lena stared out into the parking lot, empty now but still echoing with something holy. She wasn't the girl who had walked into that auditorium. Something had shifted inside her. She wasn't even sure what to call it. But it felt like beginning. The next morning, everything spread. Clips of her performance, shaky and grainy from phone cameras, flooded social media. Mysterious girl stuns auditorium with haunting performance. Teen pianist silences critics with raw emotional rendition. Hashtags trended. Comments poured in. She didn't understand most of it at first. People from places she'd never been, using words like gifted, real, needed this today. Her inbox overflowed. One message stood out, an invitation to attend a summer arts conservatory in Vermont. Full scholarship. Lena read it 3 times to make sure it was real. Kessler, meanwhile, was facing questions he couldn't answer. Parents called the school. Alumni emailed the board. One brave student shared her story about how he'd once broken her spirit so badly she quit piano for a year. Another added hers. And another. The music department called an emergency meeting. By the following Friday, he was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He didn't speak to Lena. Not once. Just packed his briefcase and walked out without a word. But Lena didn't need words from him anymore. She didn't crave his approval. She didn't shrink from his judgment. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of his silence, because now the world was listening to her. That Saturday, she returned to the same stage. Empty seats. No audience. Just her and the piano. She sat quietly, staring at the keys. Her reflection in the glossy black surface looked different now. Older somehow. Stronger. She played nothing for 10 minutes. Just sat. Then she reached forward and placed her fingers gently on the keys. And she played. For no one. For everyone. For herself. The sun filtered through the music room windows like golden threads of forgiveness. Dust danced in the light, and the air smelled of old varnish and something quieter, memory. Lena sat at the piano, not playing, just tracing the edges of the keys as though each one carried a story. In a way, they did. She could still hear the echo of that night, the applause, the shift, the way the world had tilted beneath her feet and righted itself for the first time. But something strange had happened since. In the days after the performance, Lena had expected joy, pride, maybe even relief. Instead, she found herself walking through the halls of her school with a kind of cautious distance, like someone who had survived a fire and still smelled the smoke. Her classmates looked at her differently now. Not cruelly, not kindly, just with curiosity, the way people look at something they can't quite figure out. The girl who had never spoken above a whisper had become the one everyone whispered about. Some tried to talk to her. Some didn't know how. Erica passed her in the corridor 3 times without speaking. On the 4th, she stopped. "Congratulations," she said, eyes narrowing slightly. "You had your moment." Lena didn't respond. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. Maybe it was both. Erica walked away before Lena could decide. Meanwhile, Mr. Kessler's absence hung over the music department like fog over a river. No one talked about it, but everyone felt it. Some said he had resigned. Others claimed he was biding his time, waiting for the noise to die down. But the noise didn't die. Not this time. A parent meeting was held behind closed doors. Some of the students who had feared him now spoke openly, about years of being pushed to the edge, about tears behind practice room doors, about how they'd been told they weren't good enough, fast enough, robotic enough. One boy described how Kessler made him play scales for a month as punishment for improvising a few jazz notes. "He told me expression was weakness," the boy said. Lena sat in the back of that meeting, hands folded tightly, her grandmother beside her. When her turn came, she stood. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with quiet precision, like each word was a note on a page she had finally learned to read for herself. "He told me my playing was soft, that no one would ever clap for someone who played like they were feeling something," she said. "But that night, when I played what I felt, people didn't just clap, they listened. Maybe for the first time." Silence fell over the room like dusk. And in that silence, a decision was made. Mr. Kessler would not return. His reign, long, cold, and unchallenged, was over. Lena thought she might feel triumphant, but what she felt was free. Weeks passed. The Arts Conservatory in Vermont sent her a second email, this time with forms, travel information, and a personal note from the director. "We don't just want your music, Lena," it read. "We want your story." She printed it out and taped it above her desk. Still, even in the quiet of victory, there were shadows. One afternoon, as she packed her music books in the empty classroom, a woman entered. She was tall, graceful, with hair pulled back in a low bun and eyes that didn't blink often. She introduced herself as Miss Hart, the interim director. "I've read your name in 3 different newspapers," she said, setting her bag down. Lena blushed. "I didn't expect any of that." "Great musicians rarely do," Miss Hart said. "I'd like you to consider something, not just playing. Teaching. You have a way of reminding people why music matters." Lena stared at her. I'm not qualified to teach anyone," Miss Hart smiled. "And yet, somehow, you taught a whole room of strangers what beauty sounds like." It was the first time anyone had said it like that. She didn't agree right away, but she didn't say no, either. That evening, she went home and pulled out the old keyboard she had kept in her closet, the one with 2 missing keys and a broken volume button. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called a neighborhood girl named Ava, 8 years old, shy, often seen sketching animals in the park. "Would you like to learn a little piano?" Lena asked softly. A pause, then a whisper. "Can I draw the notes?" Lena smiled. "You can draw whatever you hear." And just like that, a seed was planted. Summer neared. The plane ticket to Vermont felt both unreal and inevitable. Lena packed it into an envelope, along with a photo of her grandmother and the newspaper clipping from decades ago. She wasn't just carrying luggage, she was carrying legacy. On her last day in town before leaving for the conservatory, the school held a farewell event. It wasn't elaborate, just a few students, teachers, and community members in the auditorium where it had all happened. The same piano still sat at center stage. The same lights still hung above. But something felt different. Maybe because this time, Lena wasn't walking in hoping to be allowed. She was invited. She sat at the bench and placed her fingers over the keys once again. The chatter died down. This time she didn't play a dramatic piece. She played something small, gentle. It didn't soar, it settled, like a letter written by hand, not email, like the last rays of sunset kissing the tops of trees, like a voice that finally found its strength not in shouting, but in being heard. She finished. No thunderous applause, just steady clapping, and that was enough. As she turned to leave the stage, a familiar voice called her name. She turned. Mr. Kessler stood at the back of the auditorium, his posture rigid, suit too stiff for the moment. For a second, everyone stilled. He walked forward, slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "I came to listen," he said. "Nothing more." Lena said nothing. "I've been wrong about many things," he continued. "About control, about expression, about what music is supposed to sound like." He stopped a few feet away. "You reminded me it's not about sounding perfect," he said, eyes lowered. "It's about meaning something." He looked up. "And you, Lena, you meant something." Lena didn't respond with anger. She didn't offer forgiveness either. She simply nodded. "I know," and walked away. Not to erase the past, but to leave it where it belonged. Outside, the air was cool again, that early summer kind of cool where the wind smells of cut grass and possibility. Lena turned to Ruth, who stood by the car, arms folded in that proud, familiar way. "Ready?" her grandmother asked. Lena looked back at the auditorium one last time. "Yes," she said, and this time she meant it. The train to Vermont wound like a ribbon through the countryside, past sleepy towns, still lakes, and birch trees that flickered silver in the summer light. Lena sat by the window with her headphones on, but no music played. She just watched. The rhythm of the tracks beneath her was its own kind of melody, steady, deliberate, unhurried. Unlike her heart, she carried only 2 bags and a small worn notebook that had once belonged to her mother. Inside it, handwritten in pencil, were half-finished songs, stray lines of poetry, and doodles of stars. Lena didn't understand most of it, but something about the softness of the writing, the way some pages were smudged with what looked like tears, felt like a kind of blessing. By the time the train pulled into the conservatory station, the air had cooled and the sky had turned the color of old lavender. The campus was unlike anything Lena had known. Red-bricked buildings nestled into green hills, practice rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, students wandering with violin cases, sketchbooks, and wild-eyed dreams. It was beautiful in that quiet, intimidating way, like it had never made space for a girl like her before. But here she was. Her dorm room was small, but filled with light. There was a baby grand piano in the communal lounge downstairs. Every night, someone different played. Sometimes a dizzying jazz riff, sometimes a haunting waltz, sometimes something strange and avant-garde that sounded like a storm arguing with itself. Lena waited 3 nights before she touched the keys. When she finally sat down, there were only 2 people nearby. One reading, one sketching. Neither looked up. She didn't play long, just enough. Just enough to remember why she'd come. The next day, auditions began. They weren't just auditions for placement. They were quiet announcements. "This is who I am. This is what I bring. This is how loudly I want the world to feel me." Lena's turn came late in the day. The panel consisted of 3 instructors, none of whom smiled. Not cold, but clinical. They introduced themselves with swift nods, eyes already on her sheet music. She didn't bring sheet music. "I prefer to play from memory," she said quietly. One of them looked up. "Improvisation?" "No," she said. "Memory." The piece she chose was not technically difficult. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. But it was hers. She played it like she'd played that night on the auditorium stage, like the notes had been sewn into her skin. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then one instructor scribbled something. Another looked mildly curious. The third said, "You'll need to sharpen your dynamic control, and you rely too heavily on rubato to cover technical transitions." Lena nodded once. "Okay." They didn't say more. She left the room feeling not defeated, but dimmed. It was the kind of place where brilliance was assumed, where softness was politely ignored. Days passed, her schedule filled with theory classes, technique workshops, performance labs. Every student she met had a resume that read like a novel. Concert competitions, famous instructors, conservatory lineage. One girl casually mentioned she'd played at Carnegie Hall. Another had composed an entire symphony at 15. Lena felt like a whisper in a chorus of thunder. Still, she worked. She practiced late at night when no one watched. She studied music like it was a foreign language she had once known and now had to relearn. But something strange began to happen. She started to lose her voice, not physically, but musically. Her playing became clean, precise, safe. Her fingers moved like they were following instructions instead of telling stories. And each time she left the piano bench, she felt hollow. Then one Thursday afternoon, the director of the conservatory, Lena, requested to see her. Marin was legendary, a former concert pianist turned mentor. Elegant in posture, sharp in gaze, always dressed in charcoal grays, like she'd stepped out of an old photograph. "I watched your audition replay," Marin said, motioning for Lena to sit across from her desk. "And I've watched your progress the last few weeks." Lena nodded. Her throat tightened. "You're technically improving. Your execution is competent. Your interpretations are aligned with expectations." Lena nodded again, slower this time. Then Marin leaned forward, her voice softening. "But Lena, I didn't bring you here for competence." Lena blinked. "I don't understand." Marin picked up a folder from her desk. Inside it were printed screenshots of Lena's performance from the auditorium, the one that had gone viral. Photos of her at the piano, eyes closed, face illuminated, hands trembling. "This," Marin said, tapping a finger on one image, "is why you're here." Lena stared at it. "You played that night like your soul had no skin. And now you play like you're afraid to be heard." Lena felt something fracture inside her. I thought I had to be perfect here, that anything messy would be seen as untrained." Marin smiled, gently, not cruelly. "Messy is human, and your humanity is what made people cry." Lena looked away. "But no one claps here. No one feels anything." "That's because most of them are still performing for their old ghosts," Marin said. "You don't need to." A long pause filled the room. Then Marin stood. "You'll be performing in our midsummer recital in 2 weeks. Choose any piece you want. No approval needed. Just play like you mean it." As Lena walked back across campus, the wind stirred the trees overhead. The branches whispered something she couldn't quite hear, but could feel. Something like her mother's humming. Something like the pages in her old notebook fluttering open. That night, she took out the notebook again. She found a page near the back, one her mother had scribbled across in haste. It wasn't music. It was a single sentence, written twice. "You are not too much. You are just enough to break through." Lena read it over and over, and in the quiet of that dorm room she began to compose again, not like a student trying to pass, but like a girl remembering how to speak in sound. The notes came slowly, but they came. 2 weeks later, the recital hall was full. Marin sat in the front row. Lena walked on stage in a midnight blue dress her grandmother had sent by mail, hemmed with care and prayer. She sat at the Steinway Grand with hands steady, back straight. No introductions, no announcement, just breath and then music. The piece she played was her own, a song not born from textbooks, but from long silences, whispered dreams, and second chances. It started like rain on an old roof, soft, uneven, familiar. Then it grew, wove into something shimmering and aching, like a girl walking through fear toward light. The final note hung in the air like a secret. Then silence. Not polite, sacred. And in that silence, Marin stood first, then another, and another, until the whole room rose. And Lena, shy, soft-spoken Lena, stood not in the shadow of greatness, but in the full golden glow of her own. Lena sat on a stone bench beneath an old oak just outside the conservatory hall, her hands resting in her lap, still trembling faintly from the performance. The clapping had long since faded. The room had emptied, but her heart hadn't slowed. Not yet. She had done it. More than that, she had meant it. Every note had poured out like memory, each chord carrying with it the ache and wonder of every day she had doubted she belonged. And they had stood for her. They had listened. Above her, the wind sifted through leaves like breath through lace. The sky was deepening to violet. She thought of Ruth, probably sitting at the kitchen table by now, a cup of tea in her favorite mug, rereading Lena's latest letter like it held more truth than the newspapers ever could. A soft cough behind her broke the stillness. Lena turned. A man in a slate-gray blazer stood a few feet away. Tall, composed, with hair silver at the temples, and the kind of presence that didn't need an introduction. He didn't offer one, either. Instead, he said, "I've heard hundreds of performances in that hall, but yours?" He paused, choosing his words like notes. "Yours felt like prayer." Lena blinked, unsure how to respond. Thank you, she said, her voice nearly a whisper. He stepped closer, extending a sleek black card. Gideon Slate, he said. I manage talent, mostly classical, sometimes crossover. I represent a few names you might know. Malin, Isandro Velasquez. Lena's breath caught. She did know those names. Names whispered in the music world like royalty. Names on billboards in New York and Paris. He watched her reaction carefully. You have something I don't see very often, he continued. Not just skill. Soul. That's the currency people don't know they're starving for until they hear it. She glanced down at the card. Slate and Finch Talent Group. The kind of agency that turned musicians into legends or burned them out trying. I'm not sure I'm ready for all that, she said softly. You weren't ready tonight either, he replied, and look what happened. A pause. Then, more gently, I'm not asking you to decide now, just to consider. We have a summer showcase in New York next month. I'd like to feature you. Lena's heart swelled with something like awe, or fear, or both. I'll think about it, she said. He smiled faintly. Do. Then he was gone, like a breeze that leaves your skin tingling long after it passes. For the next 2 days, Lena carried that card everywhere. She didn't tell anyone, not her roommate, not Marin, not even her grandmother. It felt too delicate, like speaking it aloud might make it vanish. But it didn't vanish. In fact, Gideon emailed her 2 days later. A formal invitation, plane ticket included. All we ask is one piece. Whatever you like, just be who you were that night. The phrase echoed in her mind. Be who you were that night. The trouble was she wasn't sure who that even was anymore. She accepted the invitation. New York was everything Vermont wasn't. Loud, fast, electric. She arrived in a city that didn't sleep and barely paused to breathe. The showcase was held in a private hall in Soho, all exposed brick and polished floors, with a grand piano placed beneath a chandelier like a crown on a pillow. She was the youngest performer by far. Gideon met her backstage with a nod. Play from the fire, he said. She nodded. But something in her chest was already tightening. The other musicians wore designer gowns, talked about record deals, agents, showcases in Tokyo and Berlin. Their smiles were perfect, their words rehearsed. She felt like a moth among stars. When it was her turn, she walked slowly to the piano. She had chosen a piece she had written herself, a follow-up to the song she'd played at the recital. Something that felt like an exhale, like finding home. She sat, breathed, began. But something was off. It wasn't her fingers. They obeyed her. It wasn't the room. It was still. It was her. She couldn't feel the song. Halfway through, panic bloomed beneath her ribs. Her hands played as if on autopilot, but her mind spiraled. Was it too slow, too soft, too strange? When she finished, the applause was polite, controlled. No one stood. No one cried. She bowed and left the stage, heart pounding, throat raw. Gideon waited in the wings. He didn't scold her. That would have been easier. He said, "We can work with that." Lena frowned. "What do you mean? You've got the foundation. We can shape the rest. They'll give you a look, help with repertoire, get you more polished arrangements, marketable things. Not all this melancholy. People want power, clarity." She felt as if she were watching herself from a distance. "I thought you said I just had to be who I was." He smiled thinly. "That was the hook. Now comes the career." Something in her chest buckled. He handed her a folder. "I took the liberty of having a few arrangements drafted for you. Familiar pieces. More up-tempo. We'll schedule a photo shoot. Something a little edgy, urban, but clean." Lena took the folder but didn't open it. That night, she walked alone across the Manhattan Bridge. The city glittered below like a promise and a warning. She stood at the edge, the wind pressing against her dress, the hum of traffic far below. She remembered her grandmother's voice reading that old line from her mother's notebook. "You are not too much. You are just enough to break through." Tears came before she could stop them. What was the cost of being heard if you had to stop being yourself to keep the volume up? The next morning, she took the folder and dropped it on the concierge desk at Slate & Finch without a note. She boarded the earliest train back to Vermont. When she arrived, she walked straight to the practice room and sat at the piano in her worn jeans and oversized cardigan, the sun slanting across the floor like an old friend. And she played. Not for a crowd, not for a contract, not for applause. She played because it was the only way she knew how to speak when words failed. Because her mother's hands had once hovered over those same shapes in silence. because her grandmother still believed. Because there was a small girl in a neighborhood back home drawing musical notes like butterflies. She played, and in the quiet afterward, she knew. She wasn't chasing stages, she was building them, one note at a time. The air back home felt different. It smelled like lilacs and old sidewalks, and the wind curled around her like it remembered her name. The train hissed into the station, slow and deliberate, as if even the metal understood the weight of return. Lena stepped down with her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, her grandmother's letter folded tightly in the front pocket. "Come home, something's waiting for you." That was all it had said. No details, no explanation. Just her grandmother's delicate cursive and the quiet certainty that she was needed. She spotted Ruth immediately, standing just past the gate, in a navy coat despite the warmth, a bouquet of yellow daisies in one hand and a gentle, knowing smile in the other. Lena walked into her arms without a word. "I didn't think I'd miss this place," Lena whispered against her shoulder. "You didn't miss the place," Ruth said softly. "You missed being yourself in it." They drove home in near silence, the kind that didn't feel empty, only full of thoughts neither of them had to say aloud. The trees blurred past like pages turning, and Lena pressed her forehead to the window, watching the houses grow familiar again. Cracked fences, kids on bikes, porch swings creaking in the evening wind. But something felt different. More eyes. More watching. When they pulled into their small driveway, Lena saw what her grandmother had meant. A crowd was gathered outside the community center across the street. Parents, teachers, students, young and old, milling around beneath a hastily made banner that read, "Welcome home, Lena. You played for all of us." She froze. Her grandmother touched her wrist gently. "They asked me if you'd come speak. I didn't say yes. I just said you might be ready." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't expect this." "Sometimes," Ruth said quietly, "you become a lighthouse before you realize the coast around you has been drowning." The front door of the center opened, and the school principal, Mr. Chan, kind-eyed and perpetually flustered, walked out, followed by several students carrying folding chairs and a keyboard. "Lena!" someone shouted, and the crowd parted for her. She walked forward slowly, heart thudding like it had that first time on stage. But this wasn't New York. These weren't strangers chasing novelty. These were her neighbors, her classmates, her childhood bus driver, even the librarian who once let her check out more books than the limit because she looked like a girl in need of escape. Mr. Chan cleared his throat at the microphone. "We didn't know how to thank you. Not just for the music, for the courage, for showing these kids that your voice doesn't need to be loud to be heard." A teenager stepped up next. Jason, a boy who barely spoke in class but played guitar like he was born with strings in his bones. "I never auditioned for anything," he said into the mic. "But after I saw Lena play, I picked up my guitar again. Not to impress, just to feel something." The applause was soft but steady. Ruth leaned into Lena's ear. "You can play? Or not? You've already done enough." But Lena's feet were already moving toward the keyboard. She didn't sit right away. She stood beside it and looked out at them. People who had seen her stumble through childhood grief, who had watched her carry a backpack too big and a silence too wide. She said only one thing. "I used to think the piano was the only place I was safe." Then she sat and made it safe for everyone else. Her fingers moved like memory again, not polished, not perfect, but honest. She played something simple and unfamiliar, something unfinished even, but each note seemed to catch someone's breath. Kids leaned forward, adults closed their eyes, and somewhere behind her Ruth wiped a tear she didn't try to hide. When she finished, the silence was warm. Then came the clapping. Then came the stillness. Later that night, Lena sat on the porch steps, the yellow daisies now resting in a jar by the front door. The stars blinked overhead like quiet witnesses. She held her mother's notebook in her lap, the pages fanned open, catching the moonlight. The door creaked open behind her. Her grandmother stepped out, wrapped in her robe, carrying 2 mugs of warm milk. "She'd be proud," Ruth said, settling beside her. "I wish I could have heard her play," Lena murmured. Ruth looked out at the sky. "Maybe you just did." They sat in silence, drinking slowly, until Ruth reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small envelope. "This came for you this morning, from Vermont." Lena opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from Lena. You have a gift that doesn't need sculpting, it only needs space. If you ever want that space again, it's here. And beneath it, a second smaller note, this one handwritten. But remember, your power doesn't come from stage lights. It comes from what happens in the dark when no one is watching and you still choose to sing. Lena held the paper to her chest, eyes burning. She didn't know what would come next. A return to the conservatory? A different path entirely? But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't frighten her. It freed her. Because she wasn't just a performer anymore. She was a teacher, a witness, a reminder. And sometimes, in a world so quick to shout, that's the loudest thing you can be. The morning sun slid gently across the floorboards of the old community center, bathing the worn linoleum in a light that felt more like grace than weather. Lena stood near the corner of the modest piano room, the windows open, letting in the scent of freshly cut grass and faint laughter from the playground outside. Her fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press. Not yet. Across from her sat a boy no older than 10, his knees swinging beneath the stool, one shoelace untied, his dark hair falling into his eyes. His name was Zachary, and he hadn't spoken a full sentence since he arrived. His caseworker had dropped him off with little more than a sigh and a file folder. "Doesn't talk much," she'd said. "Won't look anyone in the eye. You don't have to keep him if it's too much." But Lena had only nodded. She remembered what it meant to be the quiet one. The one who watched the world from the corner, unsure if you were allowed to exist in it. She also remembered what it felt like to be handed a piano key and realize it might open something deeper than a door. Zachary hadn't looked at her since he arrived. He sat stiffly on the stool, eyes glued to the scuffed tile floor, one hand curled around the strap of his backpack, like it might run away without him. Lena didn't speak right away. Instead, she played, a soft, slow progression, something gentle, like a lullaby that hadn't finished becoming a song. She let the notes settle in the room like snowflakes, unthreatening and small. She watched him from the corner of her eye. No reaction, but his grip on the strap loosened just a little. "I don't care if you talk," she said quietly. "I just care if you listen." That was the only rule. For a week, they didn't speak. He'd come, sit, stare at the wall. She'd play. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 20. Sometimes she let him choose the first note, pointing to a random key. Sometimes she hummed and let him echo the rhythm with a pencil on the bench. Then one afternoon, he reached for the keys, just one finger, one note. It was a C, soft, hesitant. She didn't move. He pressed it again. This time she responded, with an E and a G, letting the chord form like a hand opening toward him. And for the first time, he looked at her. It didn't last long, just a glance. But in that single flicker of eye contact, Lena saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. As if, somewhere deep in his silence, he knew her, or knew her story. The next day, he asked his first question. "Was your mom like mine?" It was asked so softly she wasn't sure she'd heard it. She paused before answering. "What's your mom like?" He shrugged, looking away. "Gone." Lena nodded. "Mine too." Another silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of understanding words rarely reach. Over the next few weeks, Zachary bloomed in slow, careful inches. He began choosing the pieces they played. He hummed under his breath, even if he didn't know the tune. One afternoon, Lena caught him doodling tiny piano keys in the margins of his notebook, each one with a stick figure standing on top, arms raised like wings. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. But healing isn't linear, and pain has a habit of revisiting you when you least expect it. It happened one afternoon when Lena returned home from the center to find her grandmother in the attic, pulling down a dusty box labeled in fading ink, "Claire's Things," her mother's. Lena hadn't opened it in years. Ruth had kept it sealed like a wound neither of them were ready to revisit. But now Ruth placed it in her lap without ceremony. "I think it's time." Lena stared at the lid, her breath caught in her chest. Inside there were photographs, a cracked jewelry box, a ribbon from a piano recital dated 3 decades earlier, a letter never sent, and then, tucked inside the fold of an old music book, a journal. She opened it slowly, afraid it might crumble under her touch. The pages were filled with music, fragments of compositions in her mother's hand, scribbled lyrics, smudges from rain or tears, notes to self like, "Too raw, too risky, rewrite softer. But one entry stopped Lena cold. It was a journal entry, the only one dated the day before her mother disappeared. I want to believe that music can heal, but I don't know if I can anymore. Maybe someone else can take what I couldn't finish and make it mean something. Maybe one day, my daughter will understand. Lena's hands trembled. Her chest ached with something both ancient and new. She closed the journal, pressing it against her heart. And she wept. For her mother, for the silence they both carried, for the music left unfinished, and the courage it had taken to begin it in the first place. The next day at the center, she brought the journal with her. Zachary watched as she placed it on the piano. "I found something," she told him. "A song my mom started, but she didn't finish it." Zachary didn't speak. She opened the book and pointed to the half-written melody. "Want to help me finish it?" He stared at the page for a long time, then nodded. Together, note by note, they found their way. The song wasn't perfect. It wandered, it hesitated, it whispered when it could have shouted, but it felt real. And when they played it together, him on the melody, her on the harmony, Lena felt something release inside her. A closing, a reopening, a bridge where there used to be only silence. Later that afternoon, as the last rays of sun slanted through the windows, Zachary packed up his bag. Before he left, he turned and said something that stopped her heart. "She'd be proud of you, you know." Lena's voice caught. "Who?" He shrugged. "Whoever left the song behind." He walked out before she could reply. She sat there long after the door closed, the journal open on the bench beside her, the melody lingering in the room like a held breath. Maybe it was true. Maybe healing doesn't come with applause or headlines or polished stages. Maybe it's something quieter, like a child pressing a single key in a dusty room. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The invitation arrived in a thick ivory envelope, sealed with a gold-embossed crest. Familiar, formal, and utterly unexpected. Lena found it tucked between a stack of mail on her grandmother's kitchen counter, just beside a grocery flyer and a handwritten note from Zachary, folded into the shape of a piano. She opened it slowly. The Vermont Conservatory of Music cordially invites Lena Morrison to return as guest performer and keynote speaker for our Winter Reflection Gala. Your presence inspired our faculty, students, and community alike. We hope you will share your journey, not as a student, but as a voice the world needs now more than ever. There was no signature at the bottom, but Lena didn't need one. She recognized the voice in the phrasing. Elena Marin. She sat at the table for a long time, the letter open in front of her, her tea cooling by her elbow. Outside, the sky was soft with the hush of impending snow, and the wind played against the window like a forgotten melody. When Ruth walked in from the porch, she saw the letter, read the silence in Lena's face, and simply said, "Well then, it's time." Lena didn't respond right away. She was thinking of stages. Not the kind lit with spotlights, but the kind that existed between breaths. The stage where you choose whether to step forward or let the fear win. The stage of returning. 3 weeks later, she stood in the conservatory's grand rotunda, dressed in a black satin gown with sleeves that hugged her wrists like a quiet promise. Her hair was pulled back into a low twist, and around her neck hung a silver locket that once belonged to her mother, now polished and warm from the touch of remembrance. The building hadn't changed. It still smelled like cedar polish and ambition. The halls still echoed with arpeggios and muted arguments over tempo. But something in Lena had shifted so completely, the place now felt like a story she had once read, not a world she was still trying to survive. Elena Marin greeted her with the same steady grace as before. "You look like you've grown 10 years in half a season," she said. Lena smiled. "Feels more like 20. They exchanged no small talk, just a quiet glance between two women who had both walked through silence and come out singing. The recital hall was full by nightfall. Lena stood backstage, her hands folded, her mind calm in a way that still surprised her. She had nothing to prove tonight, no teacher to impress, no reputation to protect. She was here only to offer something real, and that, she had learned, was more than enough. A student introduced her on stage with a nervous, reverent voice. "She once sat where we sit, but her music taught us that sometimes the most powerful performers are the ones who first had to fight to be heard." The applause was gentle as Lena walked to the piano. She didn't bow, she didn't speak. She just sat and began. She chose the song she and Zachary had finished together, the one her mother had started. It was a tribute, a memory, a continuation. It began with uncertainty and bloomed into grace. She played it like a letter written across time, every note addressed to someone who never got to see the final page. And the room, this grand, echoing room, listened with reverence. No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. She could feel them with her. Her mother, Zachary, her grandmother, the girl she used to be. When the final note drifted into silence, the applause came like dawn, soft, golden, inevitable. She stood, bowed once, and walked to the microphone. The spotlight caught in the silver of her locket. "I was taught for a long time," she began, "that music was about perfection. That if you played wrong, you were wrong. That if you weren't powerful, you were invisible." A few heads nodded in the crowd. She took a breath. "But I've learned that music isn't about being right. It's about being true. About being broken open and still willing to let someone hear what's inside." There was quiet, not silence. Understanding. She smiled faintly, then added, "And sometimes the most healing music doesn't happen in concert halls. Sometimes it happens in neighborhood centers, in living rooms, between a child and a single note they didn't know they were brave enough to play." Applause again. But in the second row, someone did not clap. He sat with hands clasped back straight, hair slightly thinner, eyes unreadable. Lena's breath caught. Mr. Kessler. He looked older somehow. Not in years, but in posture. As though something had been hollowed out in him that would never quite refill. He didn't look up right away. But when he did, he didn't flinch. She stepped down from the stage, heartbeat in her throat, unsure if she was walking toward closure or reopening something that had never truly healed. He stood as she approached. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, formal as ever. She didn't smile, just met his gaze and waited. "I came to listen," he said, the words echoing faintly from months ago. "And to thank you, not for the music, but for the lesson." She said nothing. He went on. "I used to believe that control was power, that the louder you shouted, the more you were heard. But your silence that night, your music, showed me otherwise. It haunts me, in a good way." Still, Lena said nothing. Finally, he asked the one question she hadn't expected. "Do you think people like me deserve to change?" Her eyes welled unexpectedly. She thought of Zachary, of her mother, of all the unfinished songs and broken beginnings that were never given a second chance. And she said quietly, "Only if they learn to listen." He nodded once, then left, not with applause, not with shame, but with a strange, necessary silence. That night, Lena returned to the guest dormitory the conservatory had arranged for her. She sat by the window, unpinned her hair, and opened her mother's journal again. At the back was one last, unfinished melody. She studied it, felt it, then began to hum. Outside, the snow had started to fall. Quiet, soft, sure. A new song had begun. Snow still dusted the sidewalk when Lena stepped into the small cafe on Main Street back home, the bell above the door chiming like a soft echo of memory. She had only been back for a few days, and yet already the pace of Vermont felt like a dream she had left on a train seat somewhere between who she used to be and who she was still becoming. She slid into the corner booth where Ruth was already waiting, stirring honey into her tea. They didn't speak for a moment. They rarely needed to. Ruth simply looked at her, eyes gentle but curious. "Well?" she asked at last. Lena set a manila folder down on the table between them. "I haven't signed it." Her grandmother nodded, neither surprised nor pressing. Inside the folder was an official offer from a boutique label, Elmwood Records, small, artist-owned, and known for its intimate, deeply human projects. The kind of label that didn't chase charts but chased truth. The letter was personal, handwritten. The A&R director had been in the audience during Lena's gala performance and had followed her quietly ever since. "We believe the world doesn't need more perfect music," he'd written. "It needs music that holds people." They offered her full creative control, a home studio setup if she didn't want to travel, a producer who believed in first takes and background breath. 10 songs, 1 album. Hers. Ruth tapped the folder. "It's what you wanted." Lena wrapped her fingers around the warm mug in front of her. "It is." But something in her voice lacked certainty. Ruth didn't ask, she just waited. Lena exhaled, her breath fogging the window beside her. "Zachary hasn't been back in a week," she said quietly. Ruth's brow furrowed slightly. His caseworker? Transferred, Lena nodded. No one seems to know where he went. The center says the new home is outside the district, confidential. She looked down, her voice catching. He didn't even say goodbye. Ruth reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Lena's. You gave him a beginning. You don't always get to see the middle. Lena blinked back tears. I just wanted him to feel finished. Not forgotten. Her grandmother nodded, then took a sip of her tea. Maybe this album is for him. Lena looked up. Maybe it's not about recording your story. Maybe it's about recording his, your mother's, every unfinished page that needed someone to turn it. The words settled over Lena like snowfall, soft, surprising, and deeply right. That night, she sat at the piano in the living room as the wind whispered outside the windows. She didn't start by playing. She just opened her journal and began to write titles, not of songs she'd already composed, but of the people who had shaped her journey. Ruth's Hands, The Girl in the Wings, Zachary's First C, Claire's Final Page. 10 titles, 10 stories. She didn't sleep much, but by sunrise she knew the album wouldn't be about glory, it would be about memory. 3 weeks later, she began recording in a cabin studio nestled at the edge of a pine forest 2 hours north. It was quiet, isolated. The kind of place where silence wasn't empty, but rich with invitation. The producer, an older man named Theo with a beard that looked like it belonged in a folk song, met her at the door wearing wool socks and carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. No rules here, he told her, only honesty. The studio itself was nothing like she'd imagined. No blinking lights, no pressure, just a baby grand, a wall of books, and microphones so sensitive they could pick up the sound of snow falling outside. She played barefoot, always in the morning, before words had the chance to interfere. Each track felt like breathing through her fingers. She didn't try to perfect anything. She let the cracks stay, let the rawness ring. And when she played Zachary's First C, she kept in the tiny pause after the opening note, because that's exactly how it had happened. Hesitant, sacred. Theo never interfered. He just listened. At the end of each take, he'd nod once and say, "That's it," as if he knew the story wasn't meant to be rewritten, only remembered. By the end of the month, the album was done. 10 tracks, each one a window. Elmwood Records kept their word. No marketing glitz, no dramatic trailers, just a quiet release on a Thursday morning under the title Unfinished Things. And the world somehow listened. It wasn't viral, but it was vital. Emails poured in, letters, stories. A woman in Arizona who hadn't played piano in 30 years. A widower in Maine who said the track Claire's Final Page helped him cry for the first time in a decade. A teenage boy who wrote, "I didn't think someone like me had music inside, but now I do." Then, one morning, as Lena sat by the window drinking her tea, the doorbell rang. A small envelope lay on the mat. No return address. Inside it, folded in half, was a child's drawing. Stick figures sitting at a piano, one small, one tall. In the corner, a single phrase written in pencil, "I found another note." There was no signature, but she knew. Zachary had heard her. She pressed the page to her chest and wept. Not from sadness, but from the beautiful ache of knowing some songs don't need an ending to matter. The stage was unlike any Lena had ever seen. It curved like a crescent moon beneath an open sky, built into the hillside of a national park amphitheater. Thousands of seats fanned out in soft arcs below, filled with bundled-up listeners breathing clouds into the cool evening air. The annual Harmony for Hope tribute concert was in full motion, a national event to celebrate resilience through music. And Lena had been chosen to close it. She hadn't expected the invitation. The organizers said they'd listened to her album late one night and agreed, unanimously, that her story, her sound, needed to be the final word. Still, as she stood backstage, waiting to be called, a quiet ache bloomed behind her ribs. This didn't feel like victory, it felt like a circle quietly closing. Theo had flown in to support her. Ruth was there too, wrapped in her favorite winter shawl, hands steady but eyes misting every time they met Lena's across the wings. Even Alina Marin had traveled down from Vermont, seated in the 4th row, flanked by a few of Lena's former classmates who now mouthed her name like a talisman. But Lena wasn't looking for any of them. Not yet. Her name was announced. The applause rose. She stepped out, breath steady, heart calm. A single spotlight lit the piano waiting at the center of the wide wooden platform. Behind her, the stage backdrop showed stars in motion, soft, deliberate, like galaxies exhaling. The piano gleamed under the lights. She moved toward it slowly, not as a girl hoping to belong, but as a woman who now carried stories in her fingertips. She sat, looked out, and found him. Zachary. Sitting in the farthest row, alone, a red hoodie, knees tucked to his chest, and a small hand-painted sign in his lap, "Play the note we didn't finish." She pressed her lips together to keep from crying. Instead, she reached forward, touched the keys, and began. The song started like breath. A single note, clear, full of space, then another, and another. She played the unfinished melody again, this time not just as a tribute, but as a living memory. The cracks in her voice became the crescendos, the silences between notes became prayers. She wasn't trying to move anyone. She was simply remembering aloud. She played his note, their note, and the world listened. When the final chord faded into the hills, no one clapped right away. No one dared. Then, slowly, the sound rose, not roaring, not thunderous, but blooming. Like morning. When she stood and bowed, her eyes never left Zachary's. He stood too, and though he didn't wave, she saw the quiet nod. A kind of closure. A kind of beginning. Later that night, she found him waiting by the path behind the amphitheater. The staff let him through without a word. They stood in silence for a while beneath the pine trees. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly. He looked down. "I wasn't sure I could." Then he reached into his hoodie and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "I wrote a second verse." She unfolded it. Rough pencil lines, barely legible, but real. "Do you want to play it together sometime?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he whispered, "but not on a stage." She smiled. "I know just the place." The next morning, Lena returned home with the stars still echoing behind her eyes. She placed the folded second verse on her mother's old journal page. And then, with sunlight pouring into the kitchen, she did what her mother never had the chance to do. She finished the song, not for applause, not for legacy, but for healing. Later that year, when her album was certified gold, a reporter called and asked if she had any comment. She thought for a moment, then simply said, "Sometimes the loudest music is made by the quietest hearts." That was all. She hung up the phone, walked outside to where Zachary waited at the bench with the keyboard they dragged from the center, and began again. Because some stories don't end, they echo, forever. Sometimes we're told to sit down when we were born to play. Lena's story is a reminder that even when the world silences you, your truth still lives in your fingertips, your voice, your presence. She began as the girl too quiet to be noticed, the pianist pushed aside, forgotten, but in reclaiming her sound, she didn't just find a stage, she found her soul. The harshest voices in our lives often come from those who fear their own silence. But Lena's triumph wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving herself right, that her softness was strength, that imperfection could be beautiful, that every unfinished note still held the promise of a song. In a world obsessed with volume, Lena played from the quiet and changed everything. So to anyone watching who's ever been overlooked, unheard, or underestimated, you don't need permission to be powerful. You only need to be real. The applause may fade, but the courage to speak from your heart, that echoes forever. Keep writing your music. Someone, somewhere is waiting to hear it.